Hey, what's up, everyone? Dragging back again, here to tell you that you should be reading Destiny's Road. So, Destiny's Road is a 1998 science fiction novel written by Larry Niven, who, for those of you who are familiar with science fiction writing, the name, probably stands out to you. And the book kind of serves as a kind of an unofficial sequel to The Legacy of Hera and Beowulf's Children, which we've talked about previously on the show. It is takes place on another planet that was kind of colonized by a different group of colonists. And basically, the story follows a character named Jemmy, who, lives at the very end of this road that basically encapsulates all of human civilization on this planet. He lives in a town called Spiral Town. It's the very end of the road, and it kind of goes into a spiral, as the name suggests. And along this road, all these various human settlements, a lot of them are kind of, for the most part, isolated from one another. It's something they don't have access to each other, but everyone kind of keeps to themselves. They have basically traveling merchants who travel the length of the road. They're distributing goods and services, and these things called jaspers, which basically help with the diet, because the planet itself is very deficient in terms of a lot of the nutrients that human beings need. It was something that was kind of overlooked or misread during the initial kind of colonization of this planet. So basically, the original Destiny colonists dropped them off and abandoned them, and it was kind of the case for a lot of these settlers on this world. So they don't really know too much about the history of this world. Everyone kind of keeps themselves, and basically, when he's in his 20s, he accidentally kills someone in self-defense, and basically kind of goes on the road, goes on the run, and starts encountering these different groups, these different kind of little societies, setting up shop with different ones. He gets married at one point, and his wife dies at another point. And basically this story kind of follows his life throughout several decades, up through his 40s, kind of him traveling up the road, discovering more about the original colony, the original colonists, as he goes up. Because the further up the road he gets, the more kind of in the know things become, the more kind of civilized, I guess, if you will, things become. So eventually he reaches Destiny Town, which is where the original ship is now resides, and there he has access to all the history and the onboard computer, and basically learns of basically the history of this colony and how everything came to be the way that it is, including all the people. And then that's pretty much the story in a nutshell. But as always with these series, I like to dive in deeper. And one of the things I kind of really took from the story is that it's really a story about the benefit and the lack thereof of information. Like when you don't have a lot of information, ignorance persists. Ignorance kind of reigns supreme. So you have everyone down at Spiral Town, which is the very far end of this road, and basically marks the furthest removed from the original colonists. Surprise, surprise, they are the most ignorant. They have the least amount of information. They're much simpler in nature, and basically just kind of their society. Whereas if you go to the opposite end, Destiny, everyone there is very cultured, very learned, educated. They know what's up. And that's really what this story kind of when you follow the length of this road, you realize that it's almost a little bit of a metaphor for kind of our world. That we've all we know how the story goes. You have, people from the big city versus, the stigma of being from like, a small rural town. In the big city, you have access to pretty much anything and everything, any form of information, any form of culture, anything you want, you can pretty much get. Whereas if you're from a small rural town, whether it be in Midwestern America or, someplace in Europe or Asia or wherever, you have these small communities that have less. And when you have less, tend to know. I know that sounds really, really condescending. So I'm not saying if you're from a small town, you're stupid or anything. No. Especially now with the internet, it's kind of filling in that divide, really. But traditionally speaking, I mean, the less access to information you have. It's not saying that people from small towns or small communities aren't capable of learning and understanding the way someone from like a larger, metropolitan city is. But the difference is they have, or traditionally speaking, have had less access to information. Therefore, they did not, they weren't privy to as much. That's not to say you couldn't take, someone from there, drop them in the big city, and have them encounter all the same things. Someone who's born and raised in Los Angeles, New York City, London, Paris, San Francisco, Shanghai, whatever, and not learn any of this for themselves. But the point is, they weren't getting that same level kind of social enlightenment, if you will, because they did not have access to as much information. And that's what this Jemmy kind of learned throughout his journey, throughout his life, is that, he was, born into a society that was very restricted in what they knew. So their scope of reality was in retrospect very small. So what he thought was life in the world was actually just, a fraction of what it really was. And it took him kind of going on this journey of, self-discovery to really realize just how little of the world he really understood, and how much, bit more better off he was, at the end for it, especially what he does at the end of the story, which I'm not going to spoil. But, he basically kind of learns of something that, kind of happened that kind of resulted in the way people kind of were a little bit in this world, especially in less, less kind of, industrially kind of built up areas on this planet, and he kind of learns why some of that is the way it is and takes steps to kind of fix that. But yeah, so we see this all the time, there's that stereotype, in the big city you live fast, and on, small town it's a simpler life. But it's like, why is it a simpler life? Is it because you don't have as many buildings? Or it's not really that, it's because you don't have as much going on. The more you do, the more you experience in life, the more you take in, the more information you take in, and the more that adds to your kind of overall, psyche, kind of, building you up as to who you are. It's why, when they say people get older, it's important for them to have their mind stimulated, because, brain cells start dying. So the more stimulation you have, the more your brain is engaged, the more you are engaged, the more you learn, the more with it you stay. So it's the same kind of thing with people in life. It's, the more information you have, the better of a picture of the way the world actually is you're going to have. And when you're educated and when you have access to knowledge, ignorance doesn't persist, because you can't be ignorant because you know too much, basically. And the other thing that comes to that, in Spiral Town, is that it's not just a lack of information. It's also people who are unaccustomed to change. When you live in a fast-paced environment where there's constantly new things coming at you, you become accustomed to things changing. You become acclimated to living a life where you're constantly going to be bombarded with new information that's going to change the way you conduct yourself in your everyday life. You expect things to change. You know that the way you're doing something right now might be different, a year, 2 years from now, because you might, have new information or new methods or means that you've learned that will change the way you kind of look and do and view something. Whereas if you come from a community where, things have basically stayed the same for, generations, you will not be as accustomed to doing something different. So it's not just lack of information. It is, a conditioning to the point where you are not accustomed to changing. If something changes and you have to therefore change to kind of, survive and adapt, you may not be able to, or you will have great difficulty doing so, because the way you're wired, the way you've kind of grown up, is not in such a way where you are used to having to do something different suddenly, all of a sudden, because of new information, because new information is a very rare thing. And again, that's kind of what this story is about. It's about him realizing that, the more educated you are, the more you know, the more able you are to survive in this world, and not just always be just on the receiving end, but be able to take control of your life and kind of take control of your own destiny, so to speak. And that's essentially what he does by the end of the story. He takes control of his own destiny. He's gone through a lot of hardship, and the truths he learned are hard-earned, to be sure. But ultimately, he comes out of it a wiser person, a more well-rounded person than he would have if he had just grown up in Spiral Town. So, Destiny's Road, that's kind of what it boils down to. It's, access to information, and what happens to communities of people when they don't have the same level of access to knowledge and information as others. You see the difference. You see, what that does. I mean, if you look at throughout our history, the centers of commerce and knowledge were always usually port cities. Well, why? Because, from the ocean, you can travel. So you had access to different groups of people from different cultures, where people who were kind of further inland, that stuff was kind of watered down as it went along. And by the time it got to them, depending on how far inland they were, they didn't necessarily, get the full, length and breadth of it. So people in the big cities were usually more educated. People further out were, less so. Again, you look at the major civilizations like Rome, ancient Greece, Egypt, they were all next to bodies of water, which gave them access to information from afar. And you look at like much of the world even today, where a lot of the big cities located, where some of the most educated people in the world located, a lot of them are still near large bodies of water because that's where a lot of these big cities, still reside. But with the internet, we're getting information on equal level, and that's what you're seeing towards the end of this story too, is that his taking steps to see to it that everyone now gains the ability, and I'm not going to really spoil what that means, but he will now he's leveling the playing field now, let's put it that way, for everyone in this world on Destiny's Road. And in our world today, that's something kind of what the internet is. It has kind of leveled the playing field for anyone. And in 1998, the internet was something that was starting to take shape. It was something that was starting to become part of everyone's lives. I'm not certain that's what Larry Niven was really using as an allegory, but it is interesting that when he wrote this book, it was during the kind of the rise of kind of like the online world, everyone in the world starting to become connected. Not nearly what it is today, of course, but that was the genesis of our current society, where society itself is becoming global. It's culture is becoming colonial, and that groups of people who would otherwise never have access to each other are now getting that same access. People who are impoverished, if they have the internet, a lot of times they have access to the same kind of information that someone who's grown up with a silver spoon in their mouth has. And not everywhere, obviously, but again, that's what science fiction does. It is kind of a reflection of our own world, our own society, and and again, in a world at a time when the age of information was kind of really on the rise. It's interesting to see a science fiction story that is essentially about, human societies that are very fractured from one another, and, the steps that are kind of being taken to maybe rectify that, to bring these groups together through this, shared ability to ascertain information and be able to process it. But again, to really know what that means, you'll have to read the book. So with that said, Destiny's Road. Have you read it? If so, what did you think of it? If not, as always, I will leave links in the description section below where you can pick it up and do just that. Please come back. Let me know what you think. Again, it was an interesting read. I was always a really big fan of The Legacy of Hera and Beowulf's Children. And I'd always kind of heard that this was kind of a sequel. And again, it's not really a sequel. I guess you could say it takes place in the same universe. Literally, it's, again, another colonist ship that went to another world. But it's a different world. It has nothing to do with those stories. Although there is kind of, I think it's a poem or a song or something in Destiny's Road that it's called "Grendel's in the Mist," implying that maybe the messages that they were sending back from that planet reached someone back on Earth or something. So people know of it at least to some degree. But beyond that, it's very much its own thing. So if you haven't read Legacy of Hera or Beowulf's Children, you don't need to read it for this. It basically has absolutely nothing to do with it, other than the fact that the guy behind it was one of the guys who worked on that book, and basically says that it's in the same universe. Beyond that, it's if you never read those two, don't worry about it. Definitely read those two, and please refer back to my videos discussing them. But definitely check out Destiny's Road. It's an interesting story. And again, when you look at when it was written, I think you'll see there's a rather fascinating bit of social commentary there, which again, like I always say, science fiction is great at doing. But anyway, guys, that's going to do it for this one. We'll catch you on the next one. Peace!